Thank you all for coming tonight to our May History Talk. My name is Will Vest. I'm the museum manager at the Champaign County History Museum, and I'll be welcoming our speaker tonight, Rick Williams. Rick is a retired history educator and journalist who has written on topics ranging from religious education and student ministry to state and local history. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree in history at the Illinois State University and has served on the CCHM Board of Directors since 2017. His previous history talks on historic sites in Champaign County are available on the Champaign County History Museum website. Today, he will be talking about his journey last year to find every single rural Champaign County church site. Let's now welcome Rick. Thank you, Rick.
Well, thank you, Will, and thank you for braving the alleged coming storms. I guarantee I'll get us out of here before any baseball-sized hail shows up. I had to drive my old Jeep tonight. We just bought a new car a couple of weeks ago, and my wife would not let us drive it here tonight, so the old Jeep will take the damage if that's what happens. So I actually started this journey almost 2 years ago, maybe a little over 2 years ago. I retired about a year ago, and of course when I told people, people ask you when you retired, like, what are you going to do with your retirement? And I tell them about this project, and I get like a range from, oh, that sounds cool, to, why would you do something like that with all your free time? Because when I was still working when I started on this, so I was doing it on summers and weekends and things like that. So. But the thing that's been great about this for me is it's brought together three of my great local history loves. I love old maps, and I love church history, and I love driving through the countryside. I think I got my love of old maps from my very first career. I for 10 years, when I was in my 20s, I traveled all over central Illinois and occasionally to other parts of the state, doing insurance rating inspections on commercial property. And the thing that came along with that gig were these Sanborn insurance maps. And you go to the library now and you can see they've got, these reprinted black and white copies of them. But the ones we had were like this tall and this wide, and had layers and layers. What they would do is you would get new pieces in the mail from the Sanborn Insurance Company to paste on top of the old location whenever anything changed. And I just thought those things were the most amazing maps in the world. And they showed you exactly what was going on with all the downtown buildings. I've been in countless churches, countless schools, most of the courthouses in central Illinois, just because of those maps, showing me how to get there. And then I did study. I went back to school after I did that career, and I studied church history at Illinois State University and at Lincoln Christian Seminary. So the company I worked for before was called ISO, and so naturally I went to ISU. And then the drives through the countryside, I've done that like as long as I've had a family. Just ask my wife and kids, pile them in the station wagon, and we're going to go exploring and see what's out there. So. This has been something I've been doing for a long time. So I started this project in the summer of 2023, and I set out, as Will said, to visit every one of the sites that I could find that were shown on the combined 1893, 1913, and 1929 atlases of Champaign County. So that was my starting point. This wasn't, let me drive through the countryside and see what I can find. I started with each township in the county, and the first thing I did is I just went through the maps, township by township, and found the places where they would show where there was a church. I started in the northwest part of the county. I live in Mahomet, so I started in Brown Township. The 4 townships up in the northwestern part of the county, I worked my way along the west side down across the bottom, west to east along the south counties, and then up the east side of the county, and then back west, and finished up in Rantoul. So my interest Well, let me back up, but no, I won't. I'll do that next. My interest, and I need to make this clear because people ask me about the history of these congregations, and that's not really what I was after. I was really after the history of the buildings that were there, the church buildings themselves. So I had two main questions that I set out on this adventure. I wanted to know, find out what was still there at this site that was on the map. And if nothing was there, I needed to do some research to find out what used to be there, what happened to the buildings that aren't there anymore, and what transitions took place to the building, to the properties as they would morph through second, third generation churches. So that's what I set out to do. One too far. So this is a little close-up of what some of these maps look like. They're plat maps. They show land ownership. They show the locations of early roads, railways, schools, churches, other important features. The rural township maps would show the location of churches with a building, and you can see I've got here Stanton Township from the 1893 atlas. There's 3 churches that are shown on here. You can see they've got a little building with a steeple and the word church in italics next to it. That's how you know it's a church. So these 3 churches, I visited all these places. There's a little, what used to be a town called Sellers up in the north, the top of the map. There used to be the Stanton Friends Meeting House, which is on the west, the top east side. And then at the bottom of this map is one of my mystery churches. I probably had, out of 123 places that I went, I probably wound up maybe with 6 complete mysteries where there was nothing there. I could find nothing about it at all. So this is one of my mystery churches that I'm still trying to figure out what was there. Cunningham's 1905 history says in 1905, Stanton Township had a Christian church and a Quaker church. But the church that was in Sellers is never called a Christian church in anything that I've looked at. It's always just called Blue Mound Church. And I don't know if it was the Christian church or if this one down at the bottom was the Christian church. Landowners in the area, when I would run into these mysteries, I would go knocking on doors and say, because a lot of times, farmers, they're going to be several generations back with memories of the area. And I did find one family that said they thought they heard their grandparents talk about that being a Lutheran church, but never got anything more out of it than that. The village plats that you see on the right side there, they show a little bit more of the footprint of the church at the time. And when you pull it out, you can see a lot of times in the village maps, they would actually give you a denominational identifier. So on the top there, we're looking at Rantoul, and the part I pulled out there, you've got the Episcopal Church, St. Christopher's Episcopal Church across the street from the Methodist Church. It always says M.E. in these days because in those days the Methodist Church was called the Methodist Episcopal Church. I'll explain why in just a minute for any of you who are curious about that. And you can see the street that's between them, that is Century Boulevard now, but it was Chandler Street back when these maps were created. And you see a whole row of churches up and down Chandler Street. You go north from the Episcopal and the Methodist Church. The next one up north is the Baptist Church, the original First Baptist Church in downtown, which is now way out on the west side of town. And ironically, there is a different Baptist church in that same block right there, but it's a more contemporary Baptist church. And then this is one of the few mistakes that I found. Every once in a while I would run into these mistakes. When you go to the top of the Rantoul map, it shows St. Malachy, the next to the top one, St. Malachy Catholic Church. Well, that's not where it is. It's down at the bottom of that block across from the Baptist Church, where the Baptist Church was. So that church is mislabeled. It was a church, but it was the Congregational Church at the time this map was made. Actually, at the time it was the Congregational Church in 1929. Shortly after that, the Congregational Church disbanded, and the American Lutheran Church moved into that building. The church at the top was a Christian church. It's not there anymore. And then way out to the east side of the map, there's a Nazarene church that is still there, and the core of that 1929 building is still part of that footprint. And then just for contrast, the 1929 Philo map shows you the Presbyterian church, which we'll talk about in a little bit, kind of at the top of the pullout, and then just below it is the Lutheran church. And the broader that shows the Methodist church, and it shows St. Thomas Catholic Church in the northeast part. So the landscape of the county was dominated pretty much by Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, and Catholic churches. I also ran into Presbyterian churches, United Brethren, Christian, Episcopal, Mennonite, and a couple of Nazarene churches, maybe three Nazarene churches. So things got interesting from the very start for me. The very first place that I went was north of Foosland in Brown County to look for this church that you see along the railroad tracks on the map here. And I didn't, of course, find a church, but I did find a cemetery, and I found this pedestal with a bell on it in the cemetery. And here's what the plaque on the pedestal says. This bell is dedicated to the loving memory of all the saints who participated in giving Christ's love away during the life of the Methodist Protestant Church located on this site and the Foosland United Methodist Church located in Foosland, Illinois. Well, right away I had a mystery because I studied church history rather extensively, and I studied American church history particularly, and I had never heard of a Methodist Protestant church, that particular denomination. And then when I started looking into the Mount Hope Church, it was identified originally as a United Brethren church. So there's my second mystery. In my research, I figured out that the United Brethren Church, that denomination was established in the east part of the United States by German immigrants who followed Methodist practices but did it in the German language. It was separate from the Methodist Church. These churches started showing up in Illinois after the Civil War, shortly after the Civil War. Now, the Methodist Protestant Church, according to an online history of this denomination, which no longer exists, was organized in 1828 by a group of churches that split away from the existing Methodist Episcopal Church over, quote, matters of church governance. These congregations, quote, remained Wesleyan in doctrine and worship, but adopted congregational governing structures. So now, why is the Methodist Episcopal Church in these days, why does it have that word Episcopal? Well, the word Episcopal goes back to the American Episcopal Church, which is the American version of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. But the word Episcopal refers to the structure of the church. It's hierarchical. It has bishops. There's a weird way in which the word Episcopal derives from the Greek word for bishop, episkopos. So Methodist churches still today have bishops. They have a hierarchical structure. Well, apparently this group of churches didn't want to have to answer to a bishop. They wanted to run things themselves. So the term congregational, small c congregational, refers to churches that have congregational autonomy. They may belong to broader, loose networks of associations, but nobody tells them what to do. They get to decide who's going to pastor their church, and they decide what their worship style is going to be like, and all of those kind of things. So that's a little bit of that. So it turns out that the Methodist churches in Foosland and nearby Lotus, which is a little bitty town also on the railroad, and then a church in northern Newcomb County, which is north of Mahomet, that was called Walker Methodist Church. These three churches all left the Methodist Episcopal Church and joined the Methodist Protestant Church. Had no idea, so that was a big learning thing for me. By the time, before that happened in the late 1920s, the church in Mount Hope, which had originally been a United Brethren church, had merged with the Methodist Church in Foosland. So it had become a Methodist church, and then it was gone. It only shows up on the 1893 map, so it wasn't around for very long. The Methodist Episcopal and Methodist Protestant denominations reunified in 1939, and just assumed the name the Methodist Church until 1968, when, I'll explain a little later, it became the United Methodist Church. The Loda Church was closed by this time, but the Walker Methodist Church continued to have services until 1974. The Foosland Church, which you see on the right here, the Foosland United Methodist Church, closed in 2008, and the building was torn down a year later. So I was surprised to find, one of my interesting surprises was I had heard of the United Brethren Church in my studies, but I had no idea. There were 10 United Brethren congregations in Champaign County. They were so the one that you see pictured on the right here, the Otterbein Methodist Church, is one of the earliest ones that I could find. It was located at what is now the intersection of Illinois 47, north and west, and US 136, east and west. So 2 miles west of Fisher, at the southwest corner of that intersection, there's still a little cemetery there. It's not really marked, but there's still some graves there, and this is where that church was, the Otterbein United Brethren Church. There were also United Brethren churches in Sydney, Longview, and Broadlands. The Otterbein Church moved in 1900 into Fisher. They moved the whole building into Fisher with horses and put it up on carts, or I don't know how they did it, but so it was in Fisher until 1914, and then they built another church. And story goes that this church got torn apart, and the lumber was used to build a building on the Illinois Wesleyan campus. But that's just a story that I didn't track down. On the right, in this picture, you can see the Oak Grove United Brethren Church. It started as kind of an outgrowth of the Otterbein Church in Fisher. This is what you see on the bottom right-hand corner in the map, and you see a picture of the church that was taken in 1962, although the church closed in 1944. So there was some kind of a non-denominational church that met in the building for a while, but the community, the Oak Grove neighborhood, worked together to preserve this church until it was finally torn down in the 70s. Now this was interesting because you drive past that and there's a building there that doesn't look like a church, but it's the same size. And so of course I knocked on the door, and the lady was nice enough to talk with me. And she said, yeah, they tore the church down, but they left the foundation. And she took me down into the basement and showed me the hand-hewn beams that the new floor was put on. And then, this was a heartbreak, she goes, I did find a box with some old pictures and some bulletins and stuff, but I just can't remember what I did with it. Yeah. So I missed out on those artifacts. In 1946, the United Brethren Church joined with another German Methodist denomination and became the Evangelical United Brethren Church. So now we have the EUBC. Then that group merged in 1968 with the Methodist Church to become the United Methodist Church. So that's where the United from United Methodist comes from. It comes from the United Brethren, the Evangelical United Brethren. When this happened in 1968, there were still a handful of Evangelical United Brethren churches in Champaign County, but they all just kind of dissolved and merged together into the Methodist churches. Most of them had already done so. Now here's one of my really interesting examples of cross-pollinating. I've got two examples of this cross-pollination. One of them is in Dewey. So the United Brethren Church in Dewey is east of Fisher, so I'm still in the northwest part of the county. Don't worry, I'll move faster after I get out of the beginning of all this. The United Brethren Church in Dewey was established the building was built in 1888, and they were way ahead of the national merger. They became a Methodist church. Where'd that go? They became a Methodist church in the early 1900s, still meeting in the same building. After that congregation disbanded, the building was sold to the Mennonites in Dewey in 1955. They had previously been meeting in the old St. Paul's Lutheran Church, which you see right here, which closed in 1943. Now, today, this whole heritage is preserved in the building that you see in the top right-hand corner, the Dewey Community Church. The current complex of the Dewey Community Church, if you kind of look at the pictures here, includes a piece of a Methodist church that was out in the country that was called Beulah Methodist Church. I was so disappointed when I went to where Beulah Methodist Church was supposed to be, and it was just nothing but farmland. But fortunately, when I stopped in at Dewey Community Church, I talked to the pastor, and he said, I got a guy you need to meet. And it's Tom, who's sitting right back there. So Tom and I got together, and he filled me in on all these amazing things that happened in this church. In 1922, the Beulah Church closed out in the country, but they gathered the lumber, and they took that center bell tower with the cupola on top. Can you see where that is? They moved that into town, and they rebuilt it and made it a part of first the Methodist Church, and then that became the Mennonite Church, which is now Dewey Community Church. And then the final thing that changed in this whole configuration, on the far right, they moved that cupola at the top of the old entrance up to the front of the church, and it's still there. So you still have a piece of that old Methodist country church in between the front of the Dewey Community Church building and the rear larger sanctuary that they built later. That was an interesting story to me. Did I get that all right, Tom? Let's take a quick walk through 10 of the oldest buildings in Champaign County, rural Champaign County, that either have an original building or a second generation building on the original site. So Mahomet is where the three oldest congregations outside of Champaign and Urbana can be found. The Baptists built a small frame building that they used from 1850 to 1866 on a location that is now, if you're familiar with Mahomet, the Sangamon School was at that location, the corner of Main and Lombard, and now the school has been converted to some kind of a little mall-y thing. It's called the Sangamon Center or something like that. So that's where the original Baptist church was. The Methodist built in 1856, and a little bit north and east of there on Franklin Street, on the east side of Lombard Street, that's a couple of commercial properties now. And then there was a Presbyterian church that you see in the middle top, Salem Presbyterian Church, which existed from 1858 to 1916. And it was organized by people who left the first Presbyterian church here in Champaign because they all lived out and around Mahomet, and they got permission to leave and move out there. So that church was around until 1916. The current Methodist Church, First Baptist present brick building on the south side of Union Street between Elm and Jefferson, was built in 1867. It's the oldest church in continuous use in Champaign County today. This building originally faced east and had a steeple, but in 1901 it was reoriented to face west, and they built a new entrance, which is what you see here in this picture on the left. They built a new entrance, and instead of rebuilding the steeple, they just did a belfry with a little kind of a cone cap on top of it. The Methodists built a new building. That's on the next page. The Methodists built a new building at the northwest corner of Lincoln and Dunbar in 1895. And that building has had some additions and been transformed, but the original sanctuary, almost exactly how it looks at the beginning, it's still the core of the complex. When the Methodists moved, they built on the southeast part of town back in when was it? Back in the 80s? No, in 2000 they moved, and so this church was for sale when we first moved to Mahomet. It was for sale for a long time, and then it was bought by a Lutheran congregation. So now New Beginnings Lutheran Church still meets. That's what the church looks like in the bottom right-hand corner. And I forgot to say that I've credited most of the black and white photos, where they come from. Almost all of the color photos are mine that I took when I was there, and that's what the building looks when I was there. Something, over the last few years. So yeah, that's Mahomet. Mount Vernon Methodist Church. You might have been out when we had one of our history talks to celebrate the Mount Vernon Methodist 150th anniversary. It's located in Hensley Township. It's a little north and east of Mahomet. It was originally a simple meeting-style building, as you can see on the left-hand picture. It had two separate entrances, one for the men and one for the women. I guess it was a pretty conservative Methodist church back in the day. They added a spire, which was brought from another church. And they added that to the original belfry, and then subsequent renovations and additions in 1990 and 2000 completely transformed the look of the church that you see on the right. It seems almost more like a New England chapel-style church now compared to the original, like old-timey meeting house style of architecture. Two Methodist churches in Bonneville and Seymour. I told you there were. You can't throw a rock and not hit a Methodist in this county. That's just how it is. Methodist churches in Bonneville and Seymour. They're only separated by a few miles along Route 10. They have kind of a common story. They were both originally part of what was called the Centerville Circuit. Centerville, if you're familiar with it, there's an old Methodist church out in Centerville. It's in Piatt County, just a little southwest of Champaign County. So they were originally part of the Centerville Circuit. Bonneville built their first building in 1874. You see it in the top right there. And then Seymour built in 1887. With some alterations, the Seymour building still is exactly the same on the outside. It looks, on the inside, it looks somewhat different on the outside. They put a couple of additions on it. The original Bonneville church was burned in 1909, and the building that you see there today was built that year in 1909. It's funny, the churches, even though they kind of went their separate ways over the years, they've kind of come back together as rural Methodist churches have declined in membership, and there's been a lot of consolidation. So they're back to being part of the Centerville Church and the Bonneville Church and the Seymour Church share a pastor. They even share a Facebook page, which I thought was interesting. Let's go to Philo. So here's Philo and Homer, a couple of Presbyterian churches. The Philo Presbyterian Church, which is on the left side of the screen, was built in 1870. A renovation in 1905 moved the central belfry that you see in the older picture. It moved the central entry and took away the steeple and added a side belfry and entrance that you see now. And then on the back of the church, on the south side of the church, we're looking at the north side of the church in the color picture. The south side of the church was they added a fellowship hall, and this was interesting because they where the fellowship hall connects to the sanctuary, they left the side of the building open so that it also serves as a balcony overlooking the sanctuary, which is another one of these like still really original looking sanctuaries. The Homer Presbyterian Church, which you see on the right side, was originally just the simple rectangular building without the bell tower entrance that you see at the top right-hand picture. And then in 1909, they added that feature. They put a little addition back behind on the back, and they brick veneered the whole church. So if you go see it now, it looks like a brick church, even though it's a frame church under the brick. The church also went through an interesting transformation in 2007. After decades and decades of being a Presbyterian church, they voted to leave the Presbyterian Church USA over theology and doctrinal differences. They were a more conservative congregation, and so they were able to keep the building, and they took the name United Congregational Church, and they still meet in that same old Presbyterian building. So in 1976, throughout Champaign County, the Champaign County Bicentennial Committee designated 78 locations as official historic sites. 5 of those sites are churches. The Baptist Church in Mahomet is one of them, and the Methodist Church, Mount Vernon Methodist Church, is one of them. And you can see up on the top right-hand corner on the left brick pillar, Mount Vernon United Methodist Church still has its original 1976 historic site designation proudly displayed. Let me get a drink here. So the other churches designated as historic sites were East Bend Mennonite up in the north part of the county. Oh, where am I? There we go. Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Flatville, and St. Boniface Catholic Church in Colfax Township. So on this page here, you see East Bend Mennonites. Mennonites first met in a schoolhouse called the Dixon Schoolhouse, which was north of where the map shows, 2 miles north of where the present church is. And then after those first 2 years, they moved to a Methodist church that was down along the Sangamon River. You can see it on the right side of the map. And then they built their first church at the location where they are now, which is the orange on the center of the map. The first Mennonite church at the present site was built in where did it go? 1892, 1894. 1895. Yeah, 1895. That building was destroyed by a tornado in 1907, replaced by the frame building that you see at the top center here in 1907. And then the brick church that you see today was built in 1947. You've got two different views of it here. The 1955 building is looking north from across the road, and then the picture I took is on the opposite side of the black and white picture, kind of looking at it a little bit more of an angle. Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Flatville, the legendary Cathedral of the Cornfields, they like to call it, was originally built in 1874. In 1886, that church was replaced by a larger frame church with a bell tower and steeple. And then the present church that was designed by Lease and Ludwig architectural firm in Danville was dedicated in January of 1915. So Emmanuel Lutheran has gone through an interesting denominational journey. They were originally an American Lutheran church, and then when that church became part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, they were that denomination, and then in 2010, they left the ELCA and became part of the North American Lutheran Church. That happened with several Lutheran congregations, historic Lutheran congregations in eastern Champaign County that were more conservative and traditional in their views. They left the ELCA, which they would consider to be more of a modernist church, and joined a couple of different more conservative Lutheran denominations. This is one of my favorites, St. Boniface Catholic Church, about 5 miles north of Sodorus in Colfax Township. The original church you can see at the bottom left there was a frame building, but look at that really original architecture. That's really unusual with those round side areas. I just think that's a beautiful church. They kept that building. They moved it, and I haven't been able to figure out if they actually moved it or if they tore it down and rebuilt it. I think they actually somehow moved it to the east when they built the brick church that you see there. And they kept using it as a parish hall until 2019. It was torn down in 2019. The St. Boniface Church was one of many churches in the Midwest designed by a renowned church architect named George P. Stouduhar from Rock Island, who has quite the legacy in Illinois and even in Champaign County. News Gazette columnist Tom Kasich did an article last summer in the News Gazette on Stouduhar's legacy in rural Champaign County. Stouduhar grew up in Mahomet, didn't know that. He was an 1890 graduate of the University of Illinois. He designed over 100 churches in the Midwest, including more than 30 in the Peoria Diocese, which we are a part of. Stretches from here all the way across the state. Kasich noted that many Stouduhar churches are based on a similar design, quote, a long, narrow structure of brick with a single spire that made quick construction fairly easy. Well, you can see that style that he's talking about is very evident in St. Lawrence in Penfield and St. Malachy in Rantoul. But look at St. Joseph in Ivesdale, which was designed in 1874. What a different look that is from what he kind of boiled down to his boilerplate, where he would go into a community and this is what I'm going to give you. That church in St. Joseph, I mean, it looks much different today because in the 1950s they closed up those top bell towers and took away a lot of that ornamentation, which was just beautiful. But that's a very different look than the classic Stoutahar look that you see. Stoutahar also designed St. Mary's Rectory in Champaign and St. Patrick Church and Rectory in Urbana. Yeah, that's the next. So I found a lot of contrast between the rural communities and the rural countryside in terms of what I would find when I would go there. In general, churches in the 25 rural communities tend to still exist, either in occasionally first generation, but usually second or third generation buildings on the same site most of the time, but not always. So here's a few examples. In Tolono, the Tolono Presbyterian Church, in the bottom left-hand corner, they built a frame building in 1858, replaced that with the current stone church, which they still use in 1892. So same site, two buildings. And so they're on the top of the top left map, and the bottom left map, the orange on the bottom left map, is the Methodist Church in Tolono. They've had three churches in that same general location, although they've been different places in the north-south part of the block. St. Paul Lutheran Church in Sidoris was originally on the north side of the railroad tracks, as you can see on the right-hand map. They built a frame building there in 1876. That was replaced by a larger frame building in 1905, which burned in 1945. So then they moved a little farther to the south edge of town and built across from the Baptist Church, which you see in orange there on the south part of the map. They built a new church. They built their new brick church there in 1950, and they've since added a 1994 addition. St. Paul Lutheran Church is celebrating their 150th anniversary this year. I tried to find out information about this Baptist church, which is no longer there, and it's been gone a long time, and I haven't really been able to find anything about it. A lady who lived next door had a picture of it, but she had no idea how long it had been gone. But you can tell that where the Baptist church was, it's a vacant lot, and it's a very churchy looking, some of that churchy evergreen shrubbery that it's still there, and the walk that would go up to the church from the sidewalk is still there. I couldn't find any evidence of a foundation, but that was fun. A couple of other community-based churches. St. Joseph Church of Christ traces its roots to the Hickory Grove Church, one of the oldest churches in the county. It was located in Old St. Joseph, the original town, which is a mile north of the present town, down along what is called the Old State Road, or now it's County Highway 14. The historian of early St. Joseph, Illinois, Barb Mesnerich, described Hickory Grove Church as a white church-looking building on the east bank of the Salt Fork, just west of the town. Well, when the railroad came through, the town moved a mile north to where the railroad was, and the congregation followed and built a new church in St. Joseph. The top left, you see the original frame St. Joseph Church of Christ building. They used that frame building from 1880 until 1908. They sold it, and it was moved across the street and used as some kind of a lodge meeting place for a while. They built a new brick church at that same corner, which you see in the bottom left-hand corner. Used that church until the present complex was built in the 1970s. So the bottom picture, we're looking east from Main Street in St. Joseph, and you can see to the far right the west side of the 1908 brick church, which I've never seen this in my whole life. Yeah, imagine an old church sanctuary turned into a basketball court. I mean, you see churches that have buildings built on that are basketball courts, but they they put a basketball hoop in the old sanctuary, and they have dinner. I guess had dinners in there and stuff like that. They built a 2-story educational building, which I don't really have a picture of. You can just see the roof line of it in the middle of that picture. It's north of the original brick building, and then the modern 1974 sanctuary with other office spaces stretches all the way to Main Street on the west. Now here's my second cross-pollinization story in Gifford. Turn the page. So the Methodists, their second building and their third building, 1880 and 1905, were both at the northwest corner of Park and Willard Street. You see it at the top of the map here. That's where the second and third Methodist churches were. The Baptists originally met in the Methodist building until they shared service times, but then the Baptists built their own church on the south side of Church Street. So that's the farther south orange that you can see there. They built that church they built their own church in 1880. In 1905, the Baptists moved into a new building at the northeast corner of Church and Main. That's the left side of the picture. And they sold their old building on Church Street to the Lutheran Church. The Lutherans, let me get the story right here. And then in 1928, the Methodist, a little farther back, in 1926, a fire destroyed the Methodist church. And so for the next 2 years, the Methodists and Baptists worshiped together in the Baptist church on the left side. But there weren't very many Baptists. So the Baptists who were left sold that building to the Methodists. So then that became Gifford United Methodist Church. When St. Paul Lutheran Church built its present brick building in 1929, they tore down the church that had been the original Baptist church. And finally, the Methodist church, formerly the Baptist church, was damaged by a storm in 1974 and torn down. And Gifford United Methodist Church built a small church on the west side of town, but they kept the church bell. So there's the present St. Paul Lutheran Church in Gifford on the right side, and then the bell with the present Gifford United Methodist Church in the background. So countryside church, going to countryside sites was a much different experience. It was always going to be a surprise whether I was going to find something there or not. For example, I found in Somer Township, I found farmland where I was hoping to find Carley Chapel, which was a pretty prominent Methodist church north of Champaign, north of Urbana, back in the day. And then when I went to Sellers, hoping to find Blue Mound Church, there was nothing but a vacant lot. But I did find this picture of the old Sellers Church congregation. Some churches, and this is just, I won't go through all these, I'll just do a few highlights. Some churches remain something of a legacy in the county because they were at a location where there's a cemetery by the same name. So if I start at the bottom left, Prairie View Presbyterian Church, a couple miles east of Savoy, on the north side of Tolono Township. There's just a cemetery there today. That church had a little bit of an interesting history. It lasted for a number of years until 1924, and then it burned down, and they decided to close the church. And then in 1928, a bunch of people said, let's do it again. So they rebuilt the Presbyterian church, but it only lasted for a few years, and it ended its life being used as a school for some of the time, and then it wound up being the maintenance building for the cemetery. And now it's long gone. There's a little plaque there where they show where it is. This was a fun one. Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Hensley Township. It's about 1.25 miles northeast of Mount Vernon United Methodist Church on a gravel road, and you come over a rise and you see the cemetery, and you can see bits of the foundation of the old church that are still there. It has some of the origins of what is now St. John Lutheran Church in Champaign. The Jersey Presbyterian Church in Condit Township, long gone, But it was interesting. I learned that it had this reputation of being called the rebel church because the farmers who settled in that area had come from Kentucky and they had belonged to the Southern Presbyterian Church. And this church, I don't know if it was denominationally affiliated with the Southern Presbyterian Church, but local things that I read about it always refer to it as the rebel church. At the top, in the north part of the county, Hardwood Methodist Church. That's a beautiful little cemetery. That was fun to find. It was. Let's see, where's Hardwood? I got to read you this. So it was gone by 1912. A 1955 Courier article said, "It is now being used for grain storage on a farm a few miles west of the cemetery." Well, I went looking for that, and I found a couple of possibilities. But then when I contacted the Methodist Archives, they said it was actually moved east of the church. So I looked there too, and who knows? If it's still there, I couldn't tell if it was. Stanton Friends Meeting House. This is what Cunningham referred to as the Quaker Church. So didn't know we had this rural Friends Church. Lost Grove Church south of Homer. Big, nice cemetery still there. That building was a Methodist church. Huss Chapel United Brethren Church, north of St. Joseph. There's a really nice stone marker there. The cemetery is still there. A little story about the what did it say this? Oh, Carol Erb writing about local churches in the Champaign County Genealogical Society Quarterly said, "The final chapter for Huss Chapel was a farmer pulling the building away with a steam engine. The building destined to become a shop or a shed." Poor church. And then the bottom church, there's a marker at the cemetery for St. John Church, which has an interesting story. St. John was originally part of Immaculate Conception Lutheran Church north of Broadlands. They were all one church in the beginning, and St. John split off. They were originally a Lutheran church. Then they joined the Evangelical Synod, which is a Reformed denomination, and they wound up being an evangelical and Reformed church. And at the end of its life, it was a United Church of Christ. So it went through this long denominational merger. I found some interesting site markers at some locations, and you can see them here, and they're all over the church. I mentioned Walker Methodist Church earlier. There's a pedestal with a bell, and if you look really close, I thought this was interesting. The bottom left-hand picture shows the Walker Methodist Church, and you can see the pedestal and the bell there. And I'm thinking, why did they have a pedestal and a bell there? I didn't understand that. Cool marker by a cornfield that shows the original location of Emmanuel Lutheran in southern Champaign County. To the right of that, Pleasant Hill Methodist Church, south of Sydney. That marker was built by it's right in front of a house, and the guy at the house came out and told me the whole story about how the people decided they wanted to commemorate that church, and they built this marker. But the bell's not from the church. The bell's actually from a different church, St. Paul's, which was a mile north, and they got the bell from St. Paul's when they tore St. Paul's down and kept it to put on here. So you got two churches commemorated for the price of one. And then there's St. John Lutheran Church up in Royal, northwest of Royal. This marker is out in the country about 2 miles northwest of Royal. They built a frame church there in 1882. They built a larger frame church with a steeple in 1893. And then they built this huge brick church that was originally out in the country. And in 1912, they built that church out in the country in 1912. Where are you? And then as nearby Royal grew alongside the railroad 2 miles away, the congregation decided to move the new brick church into town. In 1928, the building was completely dismantled. The bricks were cleaned and hauled to the south edge of Royal, where it was reconstructed using the original blueprints. In 1952, they took down that towering steeple and reoriented some things to build an addition on the side of the church, and instead of the steeple, now it has this side bell tower with a belfry on top. So that was quite the transformation. I can't imagine the work involved in relocating and rebuilding the church. And it said, the source I said they rebuilt it using the original blueprints. They'd hung on to the original blueprints. So there were some nice surprises as I drove through the countryside. Things that sort of just showed up on the horizon. The church at the top and on the left side is Shiloh United Methodist Church. It's north of Mahomet. They built a frame church on that site in 1866. It was moved east in 1901 to be used for a town hall, and then it was replaced by the frame church that you see at the bottom left-hand corner. And a lightning strike in 1916 destroyed that building, and they built the present brick church, which you can see in the color picture at the top. And I didn't get it. I should have gotten a picture, but it's got this really beautiful little architecturally compatible parsonage, like just a little east of the brick church. I think that's a beautiful little church. A few miles east of Pasodum, this is one of my biggest surprises. I'm leaving Pasodum, and I'm going to look for St. Mary Catholic Church, and I come across this monster. And this is just not what you're expecting going out in the countryside. This building was built in 1894. Two previous buildings at the site anchored at what was eventually a complex that included a school, a rectory, and a nun's residence. These buildings are still on the site today. This spire rises 144 feet on the prairie, creating this, towering site when you drive east from Pasodum. Another beautiful church. Too long of a story, but you probably, if you read the News Gazette, but a lot of Catholic church consolidations have happened in the Peoria Diocese, and St. Mary is one of the churches that the church in Ivesdale that we saw, the church in several of the churches, these beautiful churches that I've shown you today are not going to be worshipped in anymore. They've been consolidated into one central location. St. Mary's people are going into St. Thomas Church in Philo. And then Emmanuel Lutheran Church, a couple of miles north of Broadlands. It's a couple of miles east of that marker that I showed you in the last slide. They went from this frame church that you see in the very center, which originally sat east and west, and then it was turned off of its foundation by a tornado, and they just moved it 100 feet south and moved it north and south. And then it was replaced by the brick building that you see in the bottom picture. And then if you look at the top where the windows are and the little bell tower, the entryway there, you can see that in the far right of the building that's there now. They have kept that 1941 brick building, and they use it as a fellowship hall. So borrowing a biblical phrase, new wine in old wineskins. This is some examples of churches that aren't churches anymore, but the buildings are still there. The former Sydney Methodist Church that you see on the right side closed in 1975 and merged with the Philo Methodist Church to become Countryside United Methodist Church. They eventually built a new church out in the country. And then at the top of the page, you see the Philo Methodist Church. So these two churches, the Methodist Church in Sydney and Philo, they merged. But this was an interesting look at the black and white picture in the top right hand, and look at the center picture that I took. That's the same building. And the people who bought that property built their house kind of like on the back of that, but they incorporated that building into their house. That was fun. The Methodist Church in Penfield is now owned by the I&I Antique Tractor and Small Engine Club. If you've ever gone up to their historic farm days, they have that church open for tours during historic farm days. And then the bottom right-hand corner is the old Presbyterian church. The Presbyterians in Rantoul had an interesting history. They were one of the first churches in Rantoul, but they didn't last very long. They built a building and then sold it to the Congregationalists, or they became Congregationalists. I haven't figured that one out yet, but they sold that original building, and then they disbanded in 1928 and sold the building to the Lutherans in Rantoul. But then in 1950, the Presbyterians returned to Rantoul and reorganized and built the building that you see there, which is now the Rantoul Historical Society. So I'll finish up with a story of how the heritage of two historic congregations in Sydney Township are preserved in the newest congregation, the newest church in the village of Sydney. So in 1966, Sydney Presbyterians built their first small church. It was called Vale Chapel after a prominent donor. You see it pictured in the center, the little black and white Vale Chapel. And at the time they sold after the picture was taken, after they sold it to the United Brethren Church. In 1899, the Presbyterians built a new building at 308 West Byram, which you see in the bottom left, and at the bottom. And then remember that bell from St. Paul's Church that was on the Methodist pedestal that didn't belong to the Methodist Church? Well, St. Paul's was a congregation that was out in the country south of Sydney. It was organized in 1884 as part of the Evangelical Synod of North America. It went through that same bizarre merger until it eventually became a United Church of Christ. Their congregation was dwindling, and they decided to merge with the Presbyterian Church in town, and that merger took place in 1968. And that's when the Sydney United Church was born, and it's neither Presbyterian nor the United Church of Christ. It's just an independent, non-denominational church. They tore down both of the old churches, the Presbyterian Church in town and the old St. Paul Church out in the country, but they kept the window. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that beautiful stained glass window, and they've incorporated that window into their church today. You can see it from the inside of their chapel on the bottom right-hand corner, and there's a little outside picture that shows you where it was. So a lot of information that I got from a lot of people, and I wanted to spend a little time thanking them for showing me, for helping me out with research. I thought this last little picture is from Ludlow, where the Christian church in Ludlow was originally located. They've got the bell inside there and the stained glass window that was above the entrance to the Ludlow. They called it the Church of Christ, and Christian church is kind of interchangeable in Champaign County. This bell is dedicated to the memory of Marguerite Walker, a longtime member of the Christian church who died in 2012 at the age of 100, and it sits in what is now a park on the site of where the Christian church originally was, and the park is named Walker Park. So that's my adventure. Getting done right on time, but I'll take a few questions if anybody has any questions about anything.
How did you possibly not just blow past some of those markers by a cornfield?
Oh yeah, and not know they're there. Yeah, not know they're there. Yeah. Some of them, some of them I found because, I'm using my maps, right?
Yes, you're at the exact
Yeah.
spot.
Yeah, but if you didn't know, oh gosh, it took me forever. Here's the weird thing. In the eastern part of the county, the eastern two townships of Champaign County were surveyed from east to west. All of the other townships in Champaign County were surveyed from west to east, and they didn't match up when they joined. So along the eastern edge of the county, there are two section 18s. There's two of every section number. That's how they dealt with it. So it took me a long time to find the marker at northwest of Royal, because I was in the wrong section 18. And I was looking for, I know it's got to be here, because the people in town told me exactly where it is. You go out here, it's at this corner. Nothing. And then I realized, it's the next section 18. It's the next one over. But yeah, oh, and that marker, the stone marker of where Emmanuel Luther, yeah, you would never find that in a million years. How did I find that? Because that was where their original church site was, so it was on my map. So that's how I found it. Yeah, this all for me. It started with the little dots on the maps. That's where every day started.
On the road.
Oh, it's great.
Out of your car.
Yeah.
People just wonder what the heck you're up to.
So nobody ever gave me a hard time. No.
Okay. Once you just start telling them.
Yeah. Once I tell them what I'm doing, then they loosen up.
Okay.
So there are 102 counties in Illinois, and you've gotten one done.
Yeah.
Excluding Cook County.
Oh yeah. No.
When you get started on number 2.
Oh, if I did this again, I would do Piatt County.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Mahomet's just real close to there, and
Okay. Yeah.
and we've got this little bit of connection with the Centerville Church being connected to Bonneville and Seymour. So, but I don't know. I don't know if I'll do it again. And for me, it started. I mean, here's where it really started for me. I should have brought my book to show you that. So the combined atlas is a book about like this tall, and it was published by the Urbana Archives back in I don't know when, and we just happened to have several copies of it at the museum, and when we were cleaning out the library, they decided to put a few of them in the bookstore because we only really need one copy in the library, and I saw that thing in the bookstore and that is mine, and I put my money down, and so for me, if I didn't have that book of maps, I wouldn't have had any idea where to start. That was my starting point for all of this.
So what you did here is just the work of a historian, and even where you're on the edge of being an archaeologist.
Yeah.
You're looking at foundations, you're going into buildings. It's when you see the depth of it, it starts to really feel awesome.
It's really amazing, the heritage of, and I don't think I think I skipped over my little statistic that out of 123 sites, less than half of them still had a church on them, and there were only 6 places where an original church was on an original site. Out of 100, I visited 123 places. So, and it was just, you just got to be a weird person like me to get this feeling of like when I'm getting close and what's going to be there. Having there were some churches out there that I knew were there. Just I don't know, for some reason I knew those churches were there. But there were a lot of places where, as I was coming down the road, I had no idea what was going to be there, and that was always really exciting. Mostly disappointing. It was more often than not, especially out in the countryside, there wasn't anything there anymore. And it was really hard to find information about some of those, rural places because they've been gone. I mean, my latest map was 1929, so, there wouldn't even be anybody alive who would still remember that, in the neighborhood. When I did get reminiscence from people, it was because they remembered hearing their parents saying something or their grandparents saying something. All right, well, thank you for coming out. I hope we beat the weather.